All right, everybody, let's start walking through our second part of our respiratory anatomy. And what this is what's called the upper respiratory system structures. And one important thing, if you look at this picture over on the right, is to distinguish upper respiratory from lower respiratory. That's actually a really important distinction, both anatomically, but it's more important clinically. For example, the novel coronavirus, COVID 19, that's going around is a lower respiratory infection. And that's an important thing to have a detailed understanding of what lower respiratory means as compared to an upper respiratory infection, because those are really important screening tools. So, just to answer kind of that difference, an upper respiratory, here's what you really need to know. Your vocal cords, many of you have a rough idea of where that is. We won't talk about the details of the vocal cords in this video, but if you look down here on the right hand side, your vocal cords are right there. So if you draw an imaginary line from your vocal cords across, basically everything above your vocal cords is your upper respiratory system. Everything below your vocal cords is a lower respiratory system. And so that's kind of your gateway. You can think of your vocal cords as sort of the gateway to the lower respiratory system. So if you have an infection that's affecting below the vocal cords, you would refer to that as a lower respiratory infection or a lower respiratory symptom. For example, coughing or wheezing or a dry cough, that's coming from the lower respiratory system. Whereas an upper respiratory system, think of like whenever you've had a sinus infection or the rhinovirus, a cold, that actually affects the upper respiratory system, so things above the vocal cords. So that's a really big general distinction here. And so in this video, what we're talking about are upper respiratory system structures. So let's start from the very top. So top of your sheet right here, external nose. So that's made up of an opening called the external nares. So that's literally when you pick your nose, it's what you put your finger through. It's simply the name for the opening, the external nares. And then the other bullet point here, supported by bone and cartilage, covered by skin. That's basically telling you that the nose's external structure, as most of you know, is made up of a lot of different tissues. There's a bony component, there's a cartilaginous component, and there's skin itself that actually makes up the structure. And so that's basically what that bullet point is hoping that you know, that there is a combination of mostly bone and cartilage covered by skin that makes up the external nose. Then moving down, we move into what's called the nasal cavity. So if I zoom in on this picture, the external nares is what you have to move through, and then you get into a general area called the nasal cavity. So like any other cavity, it's an open space. Once you travel through the external nares, your first thing that you're entering in is the vestibule. So a vestibule is usually a smaller open space. A vestibule is basically, if you've seen somebody with a nose ring that goes through their nasal septum, that's usually where that is. When you pick your nose, going back to that idea, basically your finger goes into the vestibule, and then eventually it runs into something as it exits the vestibule. But the vestibule is right here. It's the initial opening within the nasal cavity. So the vestibule is a space within the nasal cavity. The other bullet point here, the mucosa, so the lining that's open to the external environment in your nose, in the nasal cavity, is mostly made of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That's what most of the nasal cavity is lined with. However, one caveat is that the vestibule is actually stratified squamous epithelium still. And that's really how you tell from a microscopic perspective whether or not you're in the vestibule or inside of the nasal cavity. But the vast majority of the nasal cavity, what I'm circling here in the little bit lighter pink in your picture, that is covered in pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. This is often also referred to as respiratory epithelium. Then the nasal septum itself, the nasal septum is what divides the nose into left and right cavities, essentially. The nasal cavity itself is there's actually two of them, the left and the right. And so in order to illustrate that a little bit more clearly, I'm going to go over to a web page over here, and we'll go to nasal septum. And I like this picture. So this is just a frontal perspective, and so it's easier to see that you actually have this nasal septum. The nasal septum can be different. Like a lot of people, it's a little curved. It's not this perfect straight one like in this picture, but it divides your nasal cavity in half. And so that's what the nasal septum is. The nasal septum is made up of both bone and cartilage. So we'll go to a different perspective to see that. I like this one right over here. So as if you wiggle your nose around, it's movable. So you actually have cartilage, hyaline cartilage, that is extending off of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, if you remember that bone. That is a bone right here. And then you have the vomer, this triangular shaped bone here, and you have the nasal septum cartilage. So that's what makes up your nasal septum. It's a combination of cartilage and bone from the ethmoid bone and the vomer. The next topic is what are called conchae, plural, or a concha, and the meatuses that go within them. And a meatus is just an opening. So think of that as a term of basically meaning opening. And in this picture over here, so as you move into the nasal cavity, as you've passed through the vestibule, you can see these three ridges right here. Those are your three superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. Those in 3 dimensions, if we go back to this picture, in this picture they're labeled as turbinates. And so those are the concha, though, the conchae. And they have this kind of interesting spiraling structure to them. And what that spiraling structure creates is openings within them. And those openings are called meatuses in plural, or a meatus in singular. So that's what this would be. So this would be the superior meatus, middle, and inferior. And they are within the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. So they're sort of one and the same. And so if we go back to this picture, one that I might use on a quiz, because it's from this perspective in your textbook, this is clearly the superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and inferior nasal concha. Within those would be the meatus, which is harder to see from that, but I want you to know that conceptually. So, for example, I might point to right here on a quiz and say, what is the name for the opening within this structure? The opening would be the nasal, or would be the meatus, specifically the middle, and then the structure itself would be the concha. And let's take a look at those same structures over here on the model. Come on, slide over. There we go. So on the model now, this is a good one to challenge yourself with because you don't have any of the labels. But superior has a little number on it. Middle is in the middle. And inferior nasal concha right there. And so our last topic is our last topic for this video will be the palate. So I'll stick with this picture here. Your palate is the roof of your mouth. That's what it is. And the roof of your mouth is made up of a bony section as well as a soft tissue section in the back 1/3. So if you take the whole roof of your mouth, you feel it with your tongue right now, it's clearly quite hard in what feels like maybe the first half to maybe the first 2/3 of the anterior section of the roof of your mouth. That's because that's the maxillary bone and the palatine bones that are bones, so it's really hard. But if you reach back with the tip of your tongue a little bit further, it gets soft, and that's the soft palate. It's soft because there's no longer a bony structure there. It's just soft tissue. The palate forms the floor of the nasal cavity as well as the roof of your mouth. And there is a concept that you just have to have a rough idea of, which is called cleft palate. I've put a little link in here so I don't have to talk at length about this disorder, but click on the link and it'll take you to learn about why this happens and when this happens and how often this happens. But basically, it's the lack of a closure of the hard palate, which creates an additional opening between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. The last topic I'll mention, but I won't talk about here, are the paranasal sinuses. Sorry, I'll mention them a little and I'll show you a picture, but I'm not going to talk in detail. There's a separate video that I made a year ago that goes through these, and I'd like you to watch that video because it really needs the 3-dimensional software to be able to illustrate this well. So that's what that video has. So if you click on paranasal sinuses, it will take you to a separate video so you can appreciate these. But what I'll do is I'll show you the picture that I have in here to represent them, and I'll mention it just briefly. Your sinuses are openings within bones of your skull, if you remember from when we learned about the skull. Here they're color coded, but basically you've got 2 in the maxilla, you've got 2 in the frontal bone, You've got an ethmoid sinus, which are really small little individual openings that's within the body of the ethmoid bone. And then way back in the sphenoid bone, just under the pituitary gland, you also have another opening. So all of these nasal sinuses, though, are actually connected to each other and connected to the nasal cavity. That's how you can string a very thin little camera up your nose and get it into the maxillary sinus, because there's actually an opening here, which this picture does not show as honestly, but the video that I made will show you that in more detail. So those are the sinuses. The function is not lightening your skull. That's one of the reasons that your lab book, I think, still mentions to make your skull lighter, which is not true. Basically, sinuses are open air spaces, and so they resonate. So the tone of your voice is very dependent on the size of your sinuses. If you have a very large skull with a lot of open spaces, it will resonate and produce a deeper sound. When the sinuses get inflamed, they actually shrink in size because the tissue lining them inflames. The open space in your sinuses is smaller, and so your voice changes. We all know this. That's the difference between an upper respiratory infection sounding person and a lower respiratory infection sounding person. And so that's really resonation and making your voice nice and deep. Was really the best argument for why we even have these things. And that's why they're bigger in males. Males like to make deep sounds to basically scare other males away or pretend to be really strong. And through evolution, that's kind of what we're left with. So I'll pause it right there, and I'll make a second video covering the remainder of the upper respiratory system.